Prior to arriving at Stanford, Larry was at Duke's Nicholas School. Larry has done a lot he has a very diverse palette of work in terms of what he's done over his career, ranging from the study of predators and food web interactions, the use of population and modeling-based approaches in conservation biology, as well as marine conservation. And presently, Larry is really focused on a variety of issues that focus on ecosystem-based management and marine spatial planning and management. It's a real pleasure to have Larry here. Please join me in welcoming him. Thanks, Larry.
So I'm sensitive that I'm between you and your coffee break, so I'll try to be really attentive to time here. If I can. Just a couple years ago, I moved from Duke University to Stanford University, where I'm co-director of something called the Center for Ocean Solutions, which is kind of a frightening place to work because people might actually expect you to solve something rather than just describe things. And the morning talks were reminiscent of discussions that I've heard from Nancy Knowlton and Jeremy Jackson, whose own students got really tired about hearing the doom and gloom and said, I don't want to do a PhD writing the obituary for the oceans. I want to solve something. I want to fix something. I want to reduce the rate of decline, something that would be more hopeful. So Steve set me up really nice for my talk. I'm going to focus on the other 85% of the fish populations that don't have stock assessments, and particularly those that qualify as small-scale fisheries. So this is the worst-case scenario that Steve talked about, where there are seldom stock assessments, and when you use the approaches that he and Chris Costello did, you find that these are the fish populations that seem to be doing the worst. And more importantly, and he pointed this out as well, is that these are the fisheries in which actually most fishermen work. People debate a little bit about, is it 98%, is it 90%? But most fishermen in the world work in small-scale fisheries. And that counts for tens of millions of people who work not just in developing countries, but in developed countries in what are operationally small-scale fisheries. And the graphic here gives you some of the comparisons between the types of gear that people use, the level of catches that they experience, the capital investment. What people have found in this setting, I mean, there's a whole international group of us now that are involved in a study that's called Too Big to Ignore, TBTI. It's about small-scale fisheries globally. And the current estimates are suggesting that small-scale fisheries may take a biomass comparable to industrial fisheries around the world. They employ or provide livelihoods to more than 90% of the fishers, and they're careening down. So this is really something that screams for attention in my view. And again, not all the small-scale fisheries are in developing countries. Some of them are in developed countries that were formerly large-scale fisheries. There are remnant fisheries in the U.S., in Monterey Bay and the Central California coast, that operate more like small-scale fisheries than industrial fisheries. So how did I get interested in small-scale fisheries? Some of you know my background enough to know that I've been working on sea turtles and bycatch of sea turtles for a long time. And in the rightmost graph there is a reference to a paper that we put together back in, I think, 2004, where we labored for a couple years to try to estimate for the entire ocean what's the bycatch of sea turtles in longline fisheries. That was really challenging, lots of statistics and modeling and things like that to try to get to that. And what we did was finally come up with estimates for all the regions of the ocean, what's the bycatch of sea turtles, and we had good estimates, I think, for the North Pacific Ocean. What Hoyt Peckham found in this graphic was that two small villages in Mexico in the Baja Peninsula, the fishermen were killing as many loggerheads as the entire industrial fleet in the North Pacific. When he talked to them and said, you know, these turtles are from Japan, they said, but this is Mexico. Why are they, how did they get to Japan? And he said, and they're also critically endangered, and they said, you must be loco. I catch 30 in a set. And what drove that high contact rate was oceanographic conditions and upwelling that occurs in this particular bay, which concentrates the fish and the turtles in the same place. So it's a train wreck. where even fishing with fairly rudimentary gear from open pangas, the small-scale fisheries can have this huge bycatch effect. As we've worked on this, we've found more and more cases of small-scale fisheries having that kind of large effect. So in addition to their effects on the target species, they can also have huge effects on the non-target species. So Steve showed you this graph, and I don't need to go over it again except to say we're talking about the red line here, where the biomass is much lower than it should be to sustain the maximum productivity from these systems, and the rate of decline is steep. In the stock-assessed fisheries in developed countries, we're in pretty good shape, and we can debate about whether Magnuson-Stevens is doing what it should be doing, or whether the EU Common Fisheries Policy is doing what it should be doing, but at least they're getting attention. In a lot of the developing world, they're just getting very, very little attention. So if we ask from a biological perspective, how are they doing, particularly small-scale fisheries, the answer is not well and getting worse. If we look at from a sustainability from more social perspective, these are data from Tim McClanahan, and he looked at communities in 5 different countries in the Western Indian Ocean in terms of their social capacity to manage their own fisheries or to be involved in co-management arrangements with the government. And what he found was that there's a huge variation in social capacity to self-organize to do much of anything, whether it's manage a fishery or build a school in a lot of these places. And there's a lot of diversity in terms of what the issues are from place to place. And so in the very place that Steve told you is the most threatening, in the tropics, where the fisheries stocks are careening down and are at low levels, there's very, very limited social capacity to respond to these issues. And that's where we get to the problem of governance, which I want to talk to you about a little bit here. So as people have thought about ways to govern fisheries, the one that's most well known in the U.S. are fisheries regulations and top-down enforcement, and NOAA makes the rules and the fishermen complain, and you have the angst that goes on, particularly in this region of the world, continued angst for long periods of time. There are the market-based approaches that Steve talked about, including catch shares and ITQs and turfs, which have a lot of promise, but may be limited in application where the social capacity to apply them just isn't there, or there isn't sufficient strength in local communities or in governments to even collaborate in a co-management arrangement. A third approach, which largely comes out of the work of Lynn Ostrom, who just a couple of years ago won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on collective action and overcoming the tragedy of the commons, as so many communities have been able to do via collective action. And that is a third form of governance where resource users themselves have potentially some capacity to self-regulate, monitor, and enforce their own rules. And the harbor gangs in Maine, the lobster gangs in Maine, were one of the first examples of collective action where they made rules for themselves which improved their status relative to what the state required, right? And in other places around the world, particularly in island nations and isolated fishing situations, collective actions self-governance has turned out to be a pretty reliable approach. Co-management is often a combination of interactions with the resource users and with the government, shared responsibility and authority to try to achieve these objectives. And so, because I'm talking primarily small-scale fisheries in the developed world, frequently top-down state governance doesn't work because the central governments aren't very powerful or don't have resources for enforcement. The privatization approaches may or may not work depending on the social capacity of the local community. Collective action might or might not work based on characteristics in the local community. And so when we're searching for solutions in small-scale fisheries in developing countries, it's a challenge. And so there's a body of theory about social ecological systems and how social ecological systems work, where we begin to think of ecosystems as fully coupled biophysical and human systems. And in the social domain, there are a lot of levels that need to be considered, from the sacred beliefs beliefs of individuals and what they value to how social networks interact within communities, and how institutions function, both formal institutions like governments, but also informal institutions like communities, cooperatives, or whatever. At the ecosystem level, it's more familiar to most of the biologists in the room. You have local to regional to large marine ecosystem scales, all of which influence the amount and flow of ecosystem services. And when we, so much of ecosystem-based management now is focusing not just on the status of the biophysical system, but also the status of the fully coupled system. In other words, a sustainable marine ecosystem isn't one that just has more fish in the water, but also has healthier communities that are able to use those fish. People who are experiencing better nutrition, better well-being, better livelihoods. And so there are lots of ways to measure successful ecosystem-based management. More big fish is good, but more local fishing economies that work is also good. So one example case study that I wanted to talk to you about is actually from Javier Becerto, who is one of my colleagues at Duke. And he did a case study in Baja California looking at two different fishing communities. One that's referred to here as the Seri community, which is a native people's community that was the Seri were the Mexican government attempted to extirpate the Seris entirely at one point, but they now have rights to fishing in the Infinio Channel for a pen shell. There's a similar fishery just down the coast a little bit in Kino that's also targeting the same fisheries, using the same methods and all that kind of stuff. There are two species of pen shells that are harvested by divers who dive with hookah gear from a boat, and this is not high-tech hookah gear. This is like a paint sprayer air pump that they run on a gasoline motor, so it's sucking in gasoline fumes and shipping them down the hose to the diver at the same time it's sending down air. And what he did was compare the way the things worked in the Seri region, which is limited access. It's run by the Seri. They make their own rules for how they behave with each other. And the more open access, more typical tragedy of the commons kind of thing that's going on in Kino. And what he found was really dramatic differences, like the harbor gangs in Maine story, where Kino was having less than half of the catch per unit effort per hour of diving, and the densities of pen shells on the sea floor were almost a factor of 10. More than a factor of 10 higher than in Kino. So what this compares is a limited access system where communities make their own rules. The Mexican government isn't telling the Seris what to do here. They've evolved their own plan for how to utilize these fisheries. I don't have time to go into the details. Kino is open access, and it's the rush for pen shells. And as a result, low densities, high effort, low yields. So how is this enforced? This is enforced by the Seri fiercely, and part of that is they have this history of being a very threatened group, and so they watch out for their fisheries pretty intensely. They have rules that allow non-Seris to fish under really limited circumstances, but they watch those resources very closely, and they also have rules that allow the older members of the community to harvest, for example, the pen shells that are on the sandbars at low tide, so it's easy for them to go out and harvest pen shells even if they can't still dive, for example, for them. A lot of the women glean the pen shells at low tide while the men are diving for them in the system. And so it's a system that really seems to work. And in Javier's study, he compared these characteristics, which are characteristics from Lynn Ostrom's categorization of what correlates with a sustainable social ecological system, and compared Kino and the Seri against another open fishing community, Penasco, that does have characteristics which make it more sustainable. I don't know why we just jumped. So, for example, Kino is growing rapidly, Seri is growing slowly. No leadership in Kino, high leadership in the Seri nation. trust and reciprocity, pretty much lacking in Kino at high levels in Seri. So you can look at the list and you say, one of these communities is better organized to manage itself than another community. And it turns out Penobscot actually falls although it's an open access fishery, because they have a cooperative, because they have trust and reciprocity, because they have strong leadership, they're able to achieve things that can't be achieved at Kino. And so people from the Ostrom School have been looking at what are the characteristics of a fishery that might allow communities to self-organize. And this could apply in small-scale fisheries. It could also apply in large-scale fisheries that tend to allow communities of fishermen to overcome the common pool resource problem, the tragedy of the commons problem. And some of these are easy and some of these are really hard. Clearly defined boundaries are important. There have to be some rules about the distribution of benefits that allow all the fishermen that participate in the cooperative to work together. They have to have arrangements for how they make their choices as a group for how to behave. They're dealing with accountability and monitoring, so they have to know what the others are doing. There have to be sanctions for people who don't play by the rules. There has to be ability to resolve conflicts. There has to be recognition by the government of rights to organize to run these fisheries. And in Mexico, a lot of these fisheries are actually rights that are granted to the sedentary resources like the lobsters and the urchins to cooperatives that have been there for a long time, and the government basically gives them a responsibility to manage their own fisheries. And so the question is, if we know these characteristics correlate with the ability of communities to self-organize to manage their own fisheries, can that be used in some way, in a prescriptive way, to figure out like where catch shares might work or where some other intervention might work, including marine protected areas? So again, people studying this business have looked at the impact of regulatory approaches which have to do with top-down legislation and regulation and enforcement, and even to a certain degree rights-based fishing, against enabling inputs that promote this ability of communities to self-organize to manage their own resources in a more sustainable way. And of course, if there's some ownership of the resources, and you have the enabling conditions within a community, then really cool things can happen. In Mexico, where they've been most successful, giving these rights to fishermen, to cooperatives to fish the sedentary resources in their systems. In that context, I'm on some kind of timer here. In this context, they found that if the fishermen have a cooperative, if they have a dedicated access to the resource, and you go to them and say, maybe you would like to have a fisheries replenishment zone within your cooperative area, within your concession, the fishermen go, yeah, that makes sense. I benefit if I protect the fish. That contrasts with open access, where you said, maybe you would like to have a totally protected marine reserve. Don't worry, someone else will benefit later. It's not a deal most of us would take, right? So how well fishermen are willing to go along with the potential for closed areas, fish replenishment zones, and is the best sales pitch, has to do with whether they have property rights related to those resources. And so as this graphic suggests, the more complexity and uncertainty that there is in the fishery, the less likely these top-down government sort of regulatory approaches are likely to work. If things are pretty simple and you have a strong government and strong enforcement capabilities, then the top-down regulatory approaches are likely to work. And the chaos of New England fisheries is not something I'm going to try to go into, but basically we've tried a lot of these different sorts of approaches, and I think a lot of people are considering within the sectors, for example, of the cod fishery, there's a lot more community-based approaches, cooperative-based approaches emerging as experiments, which might prove fruitful. So at the Center for Ocean Solutions, we put together a team of people to look at small-scale fisheries around the globe, including a number of people that Steve mentioned, to look at what are the factors that are getting in the way or allowing these drivers of change in various systems. And one of the things that's difficult for co-managed situations or for the community-based systems to work are external drivers of change. So a small-scale community seems to, that the approach to living sustainably with fisheries in a small-scale fishery has evolved in all kinds of cultures and all kinds of places, but when they enter an international market, everything changes. When they start selling into an international market, they're no longer a small-scale fishery anymore. Their price of their goods and so on varies with the international price. There are other external drivers of change, like they have to do with climate change, where they have a perfectly rational strategy for fishing sustainably that's run entirely by the local community, but the upwelling of the deep hypoxic layer in the Pacific impinges on the subtidal and kills all their target species. And so those external drivers take a small-scale fishery and tie it to much larger global-scale markets or climate or whatever. And so this graphic here shows work from Fio McKelly, where she was looking at the impacts of these concessions on the catches of abalone, and the concessions and the protected areas within the concessions were steadily improving the status of the fishery, and the fishermen were doing better and better until a hypoxic event, upwelling of the deep oxygen minimum zone off that coast of Baja California, led to a major die-off of the abalone. So that's not something you influence by fisheries management any more than you influence the Great Barrier Reef by having protected areas or whatever, and runoff changes or mining changes or something that's external to that process. A second thing that we came up with, and Bob Stenick was actually part of this group and contributed to this example, are what are called social ecological traps. And the most common one is the poverty trap, where as fishermen fish harder and harder and there's fewer and fewer fish and they make less in money, they fish harder and harder. And so the trap is, as Steve pointed out with his little migrating bubbles, is as the fish stocks go down, the fishermen work harder and they get trapped to work harder and harder and they can't get out of it. Bob's example he talked about the lobsters here in New England is what was called the Gilded Trap, where fishermen start fishing lobsters and they're making a lot of money fishing lobsters, and they can't diversify the kinds of fish they fish, and so they become dependent on one species, and as long as the lobsters hold out, you're great, but if the lobsters collapse, you're not prepared to fish anything else. So the diversity of target species has gone way down here. And you've probably all heard from Bob about his concerns about the viability of a fishery and an economy that's so dependent on one species. A disease or some other outbreak could totally change things in a way that wouldn't work. And so the graphic here is showing the economic value of lobster landings, which have been going through the roof, some variation, but nice and high. But the economic diversity of Maine's fisheries have been collapsing. So it's like having all of your retirement account in one stock portfolio. And if that stock portfolio, if you chose Apple in whatever it was, 1978, you're doing great, right? But you could have chosen something else that's not doing so great. So the last thing that we focused on was what was called the social ecological context. In other words, how could the structure of these local human communities influence the ability to self-organize and be successful? And this example compares the fish biomasses in areas open to fishing with partial protection in no-take marine protected areas and in a community-based rights-based fishing arrangement in Hawaii. And it turns out that there are just as many fish in this fished concession, if you will, than there are in the no-take MPA. But the fished concession is producing ecosystem services that benefit people, and the no-take MPA is not, at least directly. Spillover and larval supply and stuff may turn out to be really important. So as we think towards solutions on small-scale fisheries, we have to recognize there are no panaceas. I mean, this is Lynn Ostrom's takeaway. There are no panaceas, there are no quick fixes. In order to figure out whether turfs would work, or catch shares would work, or government would work, or self-organization would work, you have to understand those local communities. And most of the biologists in the room say, yeah, we have to understand about the fish and the habitats and how productivity works in order to make good judgments. The same thing holds true for the human dimensions of this issue. We have to understand what might work within a particular local community. So whenever you hear this silver bullet will solve all our problems, you should immediately think, no. Probably there's not one silver bullet. And one of my colleagues in South America is disturbed by the whole series of moves by various NGOs and, well-intentioned actors to come in and solve a problem with marine protected areas or marine reserves or turfs or catch shares, as if doing something quick is going to solve the problem. And what this person said to me is, if you want it to last, it can't be fast. It takes time to get into these communities and understand what will work and to build capacity if that's necessary for these local communities to operate. So people have started thinking about these new governance regimes that take advantage of the structure of informal institutions within local communities in developing countries, where we know that there are a variety of things that we need to consider, like how we learn how to be more effective, or communities learn how to be more effective. Distributed approaches to management are good because it allows experimentation in different places. If a community figures out how to crack this egg and make something happen, communities nearby want to know what did you do? And it's not some big NGO coming in saying you should do X, Y, and Z. It's the fishermen from the community just up the way who say, this worked for us. And peer-to-peer information is way more valuable than some pointy-headed academic like me coming telling them what they should do. It really is important to think about the variety of scales that determine how things get managed, up the hierarchy from local communities to federal governments, but also horizontally how organizations within the same level in the hierarchy interact with each other. One of the key things that people have discovered is in these small-scale situations, and I would say probably also true for large-scale situations, what really matters is the interactions and the activities of particular individuals. Sylvia talked last night about the importance that an individual can make. So the people who are brokers, the people who are connectors, the people who are early adopters have a big impact on what happens in these systems, and we can aid them, and we can find them, and we can enable them to move forward with those approaches. One of the things about the case that Steve talked about with the loco fishery was that Juan Carlos Castilla had been working in this system for 20 years, and nothing was happening, and nothing happening, and then the Pinochet government collapsed, and they had all the science in place. There was a democratization moment where they said we can look at new options, and they created these turfs for locos during that window, and it took off and was incredibly successful. The recent news about turfs, I was just down in a meeting in Chile last November when Juan Carlos and Stefan are telling the story, is they were lucky in a way that this opened up at this time, because it turned out there was a global collapse of abalone, and the prices for abalone and abalone-like substitutes were like 4-fold higher than they had been. So when they started the turfs for locos, they were like printing money. They couldn't fail. But now that the price has fallen 4-fold, that fishery the turf's basis for that fishery is not as solid as it once was. Not for loco, but for other mollusks that have explored turfs. People are actually getting out of turfs rather than getting into turfs. And so, again, we need to understand the richness and complexity of the local communities and what works for them and what doesn't. Steve showed you this graphic, so I'll just skip by really fast by saying again, the biomass of locos in the turfs is comparable to totally protected marine protected areas, but the turfs are producing ecosystem services for people. And if the MPAs are doing that, it's indirect. Okay, so it turns out that a well-managed, community-based managed, rights-based fishery here with good leadership and so on can protect biological diversity and habitats and so on, maybe in a way comparable to excluding everybody, which is much easier to get people engaged in as saying, I want to help you have a sustainable fishery, rather than saying, I want you to not fish. That's a hard sell. And as a college professor who really loves his work, if someone said, there's really too many college professors, we don't want you to be a college professor anymore, I'd be pissed off, right? And when you go to the fishermen and you say, gee, we don't need you to be fishing anymore, there are too many of you, what's their logical response? It's not too surprising. Nikos Gutierrez put together a paper that I think is really important, and if you don't know it, you should go find it, where they looked at the co-management approaches to managing 130 different fisheries, and these included industrial fisheries as well as small-scale fisheries all across the board. And if you asked a biologist like me, I would say, oh, gee, do you have protected areas? Do you have individual quotas? Are there fish moving around, or are they sedentary? I mean, those things about the biology ecology. And those turn out to be important, but they're in the decimal places compared to, do you have strong local leadership? The number one correlate of success is strong local leadership. Social cohesion, the level of trust between people in that community, is really, really important. And so if you're looking for how can I be successful in a co-management regime, it's as important to know about the leadership and social capacity and the trust that occurs within those communities, in other words, their ability to self-organize or co-manage, as it is to know about characteristics of the species. And so this is a little quote from Nico's paper, which I think is important enough to read. Our results show that additional resources should be spent on efforts to identify community leaders and build social capital rather than only imposing management tactics without users' involvement. And I think that might apply, well, Nikos would say that applies to industrial fisheries as well as small-scale fisheries. We, for a long time, have marginalized the fishermen and the fishing communities in the decisions that influence them. And if we want them to be on board, they have to be on board from the ground floor. Oops, now I'm going the wrong way. So if we go back to thinking about opportunities for action, there are 4 different levels that we kind of classified. You can take a top-down state-based government approach. You can take market-based approaches. You can take collective action approaches, including encouraging collective action with local communities. You can establish a co-management arrangement with government and with local users and so on. But each of those require different things. And for developing countries, small-scale fisheries, leadership and social capital are going to be critical. So knowing where to make your investments in conservation interactions or to encourage conservation requires knowing as much about the local communities as knowing about the fish or the habitats. And so the questions we're trying to address now are, what are the ecological, social, and institutional factors that are correlated with success? And what kind of management approach is likely to work in a particular case? If we assume there are no panaceas, that there's not one thing that solves problems everywhere, how can we make better choices? One of the opportunities for action is, and what it requires working in small-scale communities, is really a dedication to understanding and interacting with fishermen in these local communities. Jack Kittinger, one of my postdocs and co-authors of this paper, works in Hawaii. Elena Finkbeiner, one of my PhD students, works in Baja California. And it's sitting down with fishermen, earning their trust, becoming members of their community, so that they begin to be willing to share their insights and informations with you. Ana Parma, a colleague from Argentina, said somebody has to do the ant work. And by that she meant somebody has to be there year after year pushing each grain of sand along until you begin to get the local communities engaged. It's not expensive work to do, but it's not fast. Okay, so the NGOs that want, or the foundations that want results in 2 years are going to have a tough time solving problems, I think, in these developing countries. So the goal is to characterize social, ecological, and institutional context before implementing a management strategy. In other words, try to match the management strategy to what might actually work in that place. So the strategy we're thinking toward is to ask the question: what are the attributes of the small-scale fisheries, social, ecological, institutional, and that predict which management approach, regulations, privatization, community self-organization, co-management, is most likely to be successful in a particular situation. So how would you do that? You need to identify what those attributes are, and a lot of social scientific research is already underway to do that. You need to look at those factors, those drivers, in the context of a variety of different interventions that have been done, successful and unsuccessful, to look at what correlates with those factors and develop an approach that could be used to determine which approaches would be most effective in a particular place. It sounds really complicated, but and it sounds like it would take a long time, but look at Magnuson-Stevens, look at the fisheries in New England. It's really complicated. It took a long time. We haven't solved the problem yet, but we're not giving up on the problem. We're not giving up on the fishermen. So this sort of work requires dedication by individuals for a fairly long period of time, but again, it's not necessarily cost costly work. You can put somebody in a community in a developing country for a fairly long period of time at a fairly low cost, and actually hopefully get to solutions which might be sustainable. So the question I'm encouraging you to think about is how or if a more rigorous understanding of the context and place can help us manage small-scale fisheries more effectively. And the table includes a whole set of characteristics that people have found are important in those settings. One of the questions that people ask, if leadership and social capacity is so important, maybe you could survey a bunch of communities and decide of 100 small-scale fisheries, which 10 are most ready for some kind of intervention. But the question is then, what happens to the other 90? You may have to do some capacity building and leadership development and so on in those communities so that they can carry on this approach. So just to wrap up here, I'm making the case here that small-scale fisheries are really critical for the conservation community to turn attention to because they're critical for the livelihoods and food security of fishermen globally. Most of them are in the tropics, where Steve already pointed out the fish stocks are in the worst trouble. The climate change forecasts is things might get better in the north and south temperate zones, but they're getting worse in terms of productivity in the tropics. So we're about to have a big train wreck in the tropics with small-scale fisheries, and we really need to figure out how to intervene and be more helpful there. Second, that we can use a variety of management approaches, so we shouldn't think just about governments making regulations or just about market-based approaches. There are other possibilities, like giving rights to local communities that are able to self-organize to manage themselves. We need to increase our understanding of all that coupling between the ecological, social, and institutional conditions. And I'm trained as a marine ecologist, but I find myself writing papers about governance and law now, and doing stakeholder engagement studies and things like that, to try to get a bigger picture of what's going on. And we need to recognize that at least in small-scale fisheries, and I would argue probably most fisheries, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The world should be so simple. That would be nice. Okay, so just to summarize, we need careful consideration to local conditions and dynamics before we push a new management strategy. I think we've learned enough about forcing solutions on developing countries and local communities to know that we encounter a lot of resistance. The track record for marine protected areas, particularly totally protected marine reserves, is mixed. Some of them are highly successful. Certainly, many of them are highly successful from a biophysical ecology perspective. There are more big fish. If you quit killing fish, hey, there's more big fish, okay? Shouldn't be a surprise. But a lot of those also have very poor outcomes for the local communities that depended on those resources. And so if sustainability of marine ecosystems is about sustaining the biophysical system and the community that depends on that system, you need to have the whole package. And I think the program here is headed in that direction. I have a lot of people to thank. My core team are Jack and Elena and Elodie, who's here with me, on helping us think through this small-scale fisheries team. We've had a working group that includes some of the top stars from around the world helping us think through these issues, and good conversations with other people who are helping us tune the argument. And I think we're doing questions in the panel, so thank you. And they almost caught us up on time.
Great job there. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll meet back here at 3:20 for the panel discussion. So.